Um, Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up and for inviting me, Rana, to talk about the Noise at Manchester research programme. I'm going to try and keep this to kind of 45, 50 minutes, and hopefully I won't ramble on too much and leave some time for questions. The programme is a suite of studies running between 2021 and 2026, all looking at the potential effects of noise exposure on the auditory system. And this is a bit of a funny talk, really, in that most of the studies are either at kind of the data collection stage or very early analysis. So I don't have a huge quantity of results to share with you. So I think I'll give a fairly whistle-stop tour of the various elements of the program in case it sparks ideas in your mind for your own research or indeed for collaborations, and then move on to talk about some of the often quite humbling sort of lessons that we've learned in the course of about 10 years of doing this research, which I'm hoping might be useful to early career researchers in particular, and certainly would have been useful to me at that stage. So we know that if you work in a shipyard for 40 years and you don't protect your ears, that you'll get hearing loss. This is fairly trivial. But there are so many unanswered questions in terms of the potential effects of noise on hearing. Chief among them, in our opinion, is how hazardous are typical recreational exposures, given that, at least in the UK, most people will have their overall lifetime noise exposure dominated by recreational rather than occupational sources. So finding out whether there's a real hazard there is terrifically important for us, at least. We want to know who is most vulnerable, what are the individual characteristics that make people most susceptible to noise damage, when are they most vulnerable, and which auditory structures are affected. So we've got these 6 studies going on. The first 4 of them are core work packages of the programs conceived from the outset. And then there's another couple that have arisen through collaborations along the way. And actually those 2 extra studies look more into occupational noise rather than recreational noise. But I think they dovetail quite nicely with some of the stuff we're doing in the core program and give us a bit of a 360 view on what's going on. The first of them is the Hearing in Teens study, which is the flagship of the program, I would say. And it looks into how risky commonplace recreational noise exposures are. It looks at whether damage is evident even in the very young. So people who haven't accumulated years or decades of damage, but are at that stage where they are being pretty intensely exposed in early adulthood, as many of us often are in the Western world. We're looking at which parts of the ear and nervous system are most vulnerable and who is most vulnerable. So a lot of people have looked at these kinds of questions over approximately the last 15 years, potential subclinical effects of recreational noise exposure in young people. And I think probably most of us reflecting on the work that's been done, and that very much includes the work of our own lab, has not been ideal. And I think at the time we built our methods based on the best information available, but I think it's good to be straightforward about it and recognize that there's things that we need to do differently. And when designing this study, I think we were all clear that it needed to have a few key components. First was that it needed to look at a wide variety of auditory structures. So I think there's relatively little point at looking at, well, not little point, but it's limiting to look at one specific pathophysiology in isolation, because so often we realize that they now occur in combination, and that disentangling those various kinds of damages is a pretty important goal of this kind of research. Certainly, a lot of these need to be subclinical measures. We need to go far beyond the audiogram and look at things that might nonetheless occur as a result of noise exposure and potentially have effects on perception, despite not affecting the audiogram, or indeed be harbingers of more impactful damage to come later on. A really big issue is sample size. So we now have more and more good animal data, and especially data in species like macaques, that allow us to get a better sense of what the sample size needs to be in order to reveal the kinds of pathophysiologies that we're interested in. And when we've done so, the numbers that have popped out have been really scary, actually. If we were looking cross-sectionally, I think we might be looking at thousands potentially. And the work that we're doing is longitudinal, but we're still looking at a sample size of about 220, which is when you're doing a really extensive multi-hour test battery in person, is a big number, really. But crucially, longitudinal research. I think that was what we've known for years needed to be happening. And there's 2 principal reasons for that, 2 principal benefits of looking longitudinally. The first is the accuracy of your noise exposure measures. If you look purely cross-sectionally and ask people to look retrospectively at the noise exposure that they've accumulated over their lifetime, it's really tough to do. You're not going to get accurate measures. Whereas if you look longitudinally, you can recruit people and then be estimating their noise exposure at intervals, and it's far more likely to give you an accurate number. But the other really big issue with longitudinal designs in this field is that it allows you to eliminate or reduce a huge amount of between subject variability in our measures that potentially contaminates or obscures the effects that we're looking for. So when we look at any of the kind of proxy measures of these subclinical deficits that we use routinely in our field, all of them have a little bit of variability that we're interested in, which is the stuff that can be affected by noise exposure. And then aside from that, a huge amount of variability that is just utterly uninteresting to us. So if you're doing speech and noise measures, then there's going to be effects of cognition and motivation and attention and maybe musical experience. And even if you're doing a physiological measure, you might have things like skull size and skull thickness and tissue conductance affecting your measures there. So by looking longitudinally with repeated measures, we've got those unwanted sources of variability at baseline. We've got the same unwanted sources of variability at follow-up. And by measuring difference measures, we should be able to get rid of a lot of that and end up with something that's a far more sensitive measure of the pathology that we're looking for. An issue, though, is when you look, right? You know, if you're doing a time point 1, time point 2, when do you place those within the lifespan? For us, we've looked back over a lot of self-report noise data that we've obtained in previous studies and indeed in the literature, and it seemed pretty clear to us that we needed to focus on late teens into very early adulthood. So for most Britons, attendance at nightclubs and concerts is a really dominant source of lifetime noise exposure. These places typically represent the highest noise levels that most young people will ever have encountered. We know based on manufacturing standards that these are louder than things like earphones and headphones. I don't want to discount earphone and headphone noise, but they are that little bit quieter. And also we know from people's reports of temporary threshold shift that that's something that occurs quite reliably after things like nightclubs and concerts and is much less frequent after earphone and headphone use. So we knew that late teens into early 20s was where we needed to focus, at least in the initial stage of the program. So the design of the study then is a lab session lasting about 3.5 hours at age 16 to 17, a repeat of that at 19 to 20, and then a midpoint phone call that's just about asking people their noise exposure at shorter intervals to improve accuracy. And what we end up with then is a main predictor variable, which is the total noise exposure over the 3 years, a number of auditory measures at baseline, repeated at follow-up, and those include things like high-frequency audiometry, acoustic reflexes, tinnitus, masked speech perception, pure tone audiometry, spatial speech perception, ABR latency and amplitude, and otoacoustic emissions. And then we have a number of other predictors or modifiers that we're going to use in our models: sex, smoking habits, melanin, alcohol, pattern of noise exposure, and deprivation. Our progress at the moment is we're 18 months in. At the moment, we have a 95% retention rate, which I'm shocked and delighted by. We need to keep 60% by the time we get to the end. I think we're now aiming for 90, which is great in terms of power. And actually later on in the talk, I'll talk about the measures that we've taken to achieve this. At the moment, we've got baseline auditory measures, no follow-up. So at the moment, we can't address any of our main research questions, even in an exploratory kind of interim way. But what we are able to do with baseline data exploration is capitalize on the fact that our sample at baseline is basically kind of boring. You know, they're all very young. They've all got perfectly healthy ears and low noise exposure. So the fact that there's little genuine variation in auditory physiology should give us an opportunity to examine our measures for other unwanted sources of variability. So at the moment, we're testing for non-auditory influences on speech perception and noise, effects of ear canal size on ABR measures, and things like effects of sex and skin tone on our auditory measures. And just to give you a tiny flavor of what's popping out of that, albeit in an entirely exploratory way, we've got things like there is, you know, unsurprisingly, a raw association that we see between musical experience and speech perception and noise. And that's something that a lot of researchers see. And I think it's sometimes been suggested that this might be due to a training effect of musical experience on perceptual abilities, although that's certainly been challenged. Our data don't really support that. So for us, it looks like that relationship is largely explained by confounding factors, things like cognition, education, socioeconomic status. So it seems from our data that that relationship between music and perception might be explained by the fact that people who are encouraged and supported to play a musical instrument are just fundamentally different kinds of people from sociologically, at least, from people who are not. So an interesting outcome there. ABR wave 1 amplitude is influenced by sex, as you would expect. That's a trivial finding. But we've also found that it's independently influenced by ear canal diameter. And so, even amongst women, if you've got big ears, you've got a lower ABR, potentially due to just that stimulus rattling around in a larger volume of air. And this is kind of interesting because it points to the idea that maybe in future ABR measurements, we might be able to correct stimulus based on these differences in ear canal size, which might be useful in terms of enhancing the validity of the measurements that we obtain, but also potentially protecting people with small ears from loudness discomfort, which seems like a worthwhile aim as well. And even at baseline, there seems to be an effect of skin tone on our high frequency measures, both audiometric thresholds and autoacoustic emissions, which seem to be enhanced in participants with darker skin tones. Moving on to the After the Music study. So this is run by Carlin Murray, and it looks at why some people incur more temporary hearing loss after a concert than others. So interested in sources of individual variability in susceptibility to noise damage here, or at least temporary noise damage in this study. The possible predictors are things like skin tone. So it's suggested that people with darker skin tones might be less susceptible due to protective effects of melanin in the cochlea. Women might be less susceptible due to protective effects of female sex hormones. Age, we would have loved to get into in this study, but we just didn't have the statistical power. I think it would be really interesting to determine whether going to the same gig at 40 as a 20-year-old, you incur a bit more damage because your ears just can't bounce back as easily. So something that we would very much like to in future research, and we would encourage others to do so as well. And then the other potential factor is prior exposure to conditioning noise. So this is based on the well-established finding in animals that prolonged exposure to moderate noise reliably reduces temporary threshold shift caused by subsequent shorter exposure to very high levels of noise. So there's a kind of toughening effect, a conditioning effect, where the ears are toughened up by that prior exposure. And what we don't know is in humans, can day-to-day noise exposures, so routine use of earphones or headphones, say, have a similar conditioning effect. The study is shamelessly capitalizing on the location of our lab, which just happens to be 1 minute from a live music venue with 3 stages, all of which put out absolutely ear-bleeding noise from time to time. So the structure of the study then is they come in for a baseline test session in the days prior to a gig that they plan to go to. They don't wear any earplugs at the gig, and then they come in literally minutes after the gig kicks out, and they redo their measurements. So what we end up with then is main predictor variables are noise exposure over the past 10 weeks, so looking at that conditioning effect, sex, and skin tone. Then we have an array of pre-concert auditory measures, an array of follow-up measures, and the principal one is pure tone audiometry, so it's the average of the thresholds at 3, 4, and 6 kilohertz, and then we've got a few others besides, just in case they showed something interesting. And then we have other predictors and covariates, so level and pattern of prior noise exposure, the level and duration of the concert, which is obviously pretty important, baseline auditory measurements, and time since the concert ended. I will not present on the results in relation to our principal research questions, in part because we've only just got the data and we're only just starting to poke about in it, but also because I want Carlin to get the opportunity to present those findings first. I don't want to rain on her parade. If we look, though, at the descriptive statistics, we've got nice chunky TTS measurements for PTA, so at 3, 4, and 6 kilohertz. Nothing really for the extended high frequency measures, which is interesting in passing, and a little bit of something for 3 to 6 kilohertz OAEs. But I think, good old fashioned PTA is the most robust effect here. Also a kind of range of changes in tinnitus following the noise exposure. I think what jumped out of a quick look at the descriptive data is that the PTA shift that we're seeing, they're up to 32 decibels, which is pretty significant. And really interestingly, some of our participants attended the same event together and therefore have near identical exposure. So this is 2 friends who've gone to the gig together and they've been shoulder to shoulder all night. And what we're seeing is that within those pairs, we can sometimes see really substantial difference in audiometric shift. So in one case, it was 10 decibels for one friend and 27 for another. So at the very least, substantial evidence of real individual differences in susceptibility. Moving on, we've got the ear audit. So this is just about to launch. So this is a large-scale online study looking at the factors that are associated with development of chronic tinnitus and listening difficulties. we have to confess that this is hugely inspired by and informed by prior work on this same topic by Professor Dave Moore and Oliver Zobe, who worked together to look using sort of a similar set of methods, this stuff. And we are enormously grateful to Professor Moore for kind of guiding us and making sure that we are building upon and extending beyond the work that they have done previously on this. So it's a large scale internet survey and online listening task. And the outcome measures that we're interested in are self-report of spontaneous tinnitus. So we're looking at whether a person does or does not have spontaneous tinnitus, how long it lasts for, how often it happens. And then we're also doing these online speech tests. So they're all with digit triplet stimuli. One block is just bog standard endiotic speech-shaped noise, the same kind of thing that gets used for remote hearing screening over the world. And then there's one block in spatially separated babble. So aiming to be a bit more ecologically valid, a bit like trying to talk to someone to you in a noisy pub while there's lots of chit-chat going on all around you. And also hoping to be a bit more sensitive to potential subclinical effects of noise exposure, because this should be more reliant on binaural integration. This is our speech test. This is our software we've developed. So yeah, it's the digits 439 or the digits 472, and then you enter those on a keypad. We have gone to some pretty major lengths to try and make the software as pleasant to use as possible, really limit the boredom factor. And we are very, very relieved to note that in piloting remotely that people are generally not dropping out mid-test. They are getting through to the end of it and getting something out of it. So fingers crossed that will continue to be the case. The potential predictors then are total energy of noise exposure over the lifespan as obtained by detailed self-reports, types and patterns of noise exposure, age, sex, skin tone, and occurrences of TTS over the lifespan. So getting people to look back over all the noisy activities that they've reported and then tell us for each activity, well, how often did you notice that you came out of that activity with muffled hearing or ringing in your ears or both? So that seems like an interesting potential predictor. The fourth study is conducted by the incredibly talented medical physicist Rebecca Stewie at Nottingham, and is looking at whether we can use MRI to visualize the neural effects of noise exposure. This is motivated by a good 15 years now of looking for cochlear synaptopathy in humans, so a loss of synapses between the cochlea and the auditory nerve as a consequence, a consequence of both aging and noise exposure, but we're particularly interested in the noise exposure angle. And a problem with all of that research has been that you can cut open an animal and see if they've got synapses, and it's frowned upon to do this on living humans, so we have to find another way of doing it. And all of our proxy measures tend to be a bit far removed from the phenomenon we're looking for. So it would be tremendously useful if we were able to image these effects and actually see synaptopathy or its consequences via MRI. So this is a view of the head from the top down. Those two kind of mushroomy things we sticking out there are the internal auditory canals and the cochleas. And those black streaks are nerves, including the auditory nerve. And so Becky's fundamentally looking to see, does noise exposure seem to relate to the size and health of those nerves as obtained from imaging? So this has been kind of an obsession for Becky and for her boss, Sue Francis, over the past decade, more or less. So they've been refining these scans to try and get a better and better look at the auditory nerve primarily, although they are looking at some other areas of the brain as well. So what we've ended up with is a protocol that primarily focuses on neurography of the auditory nerve, as you might expect, with two approaches: magnetic resonance neurography and diffusion tensor imaging. And this yields two measures of nerve health. The first is nerve diameter, fairly straightforward. And then there's also fractional anisotropy, which is an additional measure of nerve integrity, which is independent of nerve diameter. And then Becky's also performing whole brain structural MRI and resting state functional MRI. But there's a problem, which is that synaptopathy is just not going to show up on a scan right away. The synapse is detached, but the nerve fibers are still there, and it can take many years for those nerve fibers to die away after kind of continuing detachment from the cochlea. So we need to make sure that the timing of our research fits around that reality. So the primary contrast in the study is between a group of 50 adults who are aged 30 to 50 and another same-sized group. Both groups are aged 30 to 50, but one has low noise exposure, one has high noise exposure. Both have normal pure tone audiograms because we're interested in subclinical effects of noise exposure here. As I mentioned already, imaging includes MR neurography, whole brain structural MRI, resting state fMRI. And the physiological measures include audiometry, including extended high frequencies, otoacoustic emissions, including extended high frequencies, the middle ear muscle reflex, the ABR, and speech perception measures. But this alone doesn't give us quite enough. We additionally need to have a young group of the same size to just check what the effects of aging alone are on our measures. And then we'd need an additional group. And this is a group that's same in age as the two principal groups, but with really extreme noise exposure and noise-induced hearing loss. So a group that very definitely has some pathology. And if I'm being perfectly honest, this is here as a sanity check for us to check what's going on in the event that we have a null result. So if we have a null result on our main comparison, then how do we interpret that? One possibility is that noise exposure does not lead to subclinical effects on the auditory nerve that are detectable. So that's one possibility. It may be that, you know, that anything that doesn't affect the audiogram is just too subtle to affect the nerve. But the other possibility is just that our measures are rubbish, right? You know, that despite trying for 10 years to optimize this stuff, that we simply aren't able to detect the pathology that we're looking for. So by whacking in this extra group that very definitely have that related pathology, it acts as a bit of a check for us, so that so if it is our measures and our methods, then we can hold our hands up and say so when we report the result. Occupational noise exposure in Palestine is one of our side projects, and that is run by a fantastically talented lecturer at the University of Perth site in the West Bank of Palestine, Adnan Shahabi, and he's looking at how the effects of noise exposure and aging combine to determine the hearing health of Palestinian adults. Aging and noise exposure, we know, affect hearing, but actually the interaction of these factors is much less well understood. And to get at this research question sensibly, you need a large sample, you need some really highly noise exposed individuals, and you need these to be in a variety of age ranges. We have found that recruiting UK participants with really extreme noise exposure, especially occupational, is pretty challenging. These folks tend not to be engaged with research, or at least we're failing to engage them in research and not having success bringing them in by and large. What Adnan has found in his research so far is that in Palestine, extreme exposures are much more common. You know, there's a lot of very noisy industries that people are working in, and not much health and safety to speak of. But also he's found that exposed individuals are just far more engaged with research and far more giving of their time. So despite the fact that he's not providing any monetary compensation, and it's often quite difficult to get to the university because you're passing through checkpoints and so on, nonetheless, people have been really willing to give up their time and effort. So we're enormously grateful to Adnan and to the citizens of the West Bank for helping us push on research in this area. I think perhaps unsurprisingly, I should say what the research design is. So yeah, people aged 18 to 80, 95 in all, varied in age range and age and exposure. And then our main predictor variables in this study will be noise exposure, and then crucially the interaction of age and noise exposure. And then secondary predictors will be age, parental hearing loss, interaction of parental hearing loss and noise exposure, with those two latter being about trying to get at sort of genetic susceptibility to noise-induced hearing loss. And then our main outcome measures are pure tone audiometry, extended high frequency audiometry, and the diotic digits in noise tests. So, you know, digits in simple speech shaped noise. And then we have secondary outcome measures, which are tinnitus, the antiphasic version of the digits in noise, which is sort of reliant on binaural integration, and the binaural intelligibility level difference, which is just a difference measure between the antiphasic and the diotic versions of the digits in noise. Unsurprisingly, work on this has ground to a halt at the moment. It's all quite fractious, even in the West Bank, and the university is just not open at the moment. We're hoping that things will settle down soon and we can resume work on this. In the meantime, Adnan has worked with Jordanian audiologists to obtain a bunch of validation data on the digits in noise, the Arabic digits in noise tools that he's using in his study. So he's looked at relations of the digits in noise to pure tone audiometry and also to the retest reliability of those measures. And he's conducted this for both the diotic and the antiphasic version of the digits in noise. And so at the top there, we've got relations to pure tone audiometry. At the bottom, we've got reliability, retest reliability, sort of session 2 versus session 1. And on the left, you've got the diotic data, and on the right, you've got the antiphasic. And I think it should be fairly clear that both in terms of predicting PTA and in terms of reliability, there's a real edge for the antiphasic test there. So in addition to Adnan using this in his research with noise exposure, we're also now in discussion, or have been in discussion with the Palestinian Ministry of Health about having this rolled out as a screening tool, because I think for the same reasons that it's difficult for participants to get to the university, it's quite difficult for participants to get to an audiology clinic. And there also isn't, to be honest, there aren't a huge number of audiology services in the West Bank. So being able to tell at distance remotely via the internet whether someone is likely to benefit from a face-to-face audiology appointment, I think is a really useful goal. So the sooner we get this out there, the better. Final study is the Airwave Health Monitoring Study, which is conducted in collaboration with Paul Elliott and others at Imperial. And this looks at whether use of in-ear radios damages police officers' hearing. So the police radio system, Tetra, has been in use since 2001, and you just have a little earpod piece that you pop in one ear only. And the Airwave study has been running for 20 years to try and monitor the health risks. Over half of UK police forces are involved, with over 55,000 people enrolled initially, and a very substantial portion of them still actively involved in data collection. And amazingly, there have been no auditory measures so far. The primary focus has been on cancer. Pure tone audiometry is not feasible for a study of this size, but online testing is possible using our online speech testing measures. And the earpieces, crucially, are worn mono-orally, giving us a really powerful research opportunity by comparing the exposed ear with the non-exposed ear. So that's the focus of this. The study design then, it's all online. It consists of questions on earpiece use, so duration of use, frequency of use, volume control setting, which ear you wear it in, and any changes in those over the course of your career. There's then questions on hearing issues. Tinnitus, do you have it? How often? How long does it last? Which year is it? And details of any known hearing loss and reasons for it. And then finally, as in the previous online studies we've talked about, you've got an online digits and noise test, and we've got a right ear block, a left ear block, and an antiphasic block, and the order of those conditions is randomized. What we're aiming to find out then is among unilateral earpiece users, which by the way is almost all of them, most people pick one ear and stick to it. Are digits in noise thresholds higher in the exposed ear than the control ear? And then crucially, is the extent of exposure over your career associated with the degree of asymmetry in your speech and noise thresholds? Similarly, is spontaneous tinnitus more prevalent in the exposed ear than the control ear? And is the extent of noise exposure associated with asymmetry in tinnitus? And then we have a whole bunch of exploratory questions that what we want to look at, including relations to cognitive decline and dementia. We're very lucky that there's going to be follow-up testing in 4 years for both hearing and the cognitive measures, so there's a real power there to get into that. Relations to earpiece-induced temporary threshold shifts. So to what extent over your career do you remember taking your earpiece out and having muffled hearing or tinnitus? And how does that relate to our outcome measures? Relations between the monaural and antiphasic speech reception thresholds, and relations between hearing, asymmetry, and tinnitus, and many more besides. So yeah, really lucky to have that research opportunity placed in our lap, really. So that's the studies. There's more information about almost all of them on the manchester.ac.uk/noise websites, and the exception being Airwave, which is kind of more cited with the Imperial, and we let them do the talking about that. So let me move on to talk about some of these sort of slightly humbling lessons that we've encountered over the years. I am a little bit nervous about this because I'm conscious that some of this is going to feel, or I might feel, absolutely obvious, and you're going to think, why is this woman telling me something that I know perfectly well already? And then other parts of it might just sound a bit bonkers. So apologies if it comes across as either of those. But in all honesty, these are things that if someone had told me them when I was doing my PhD, I think it would have made my research go a bit more smoothly. So I'm putting this out there in the hope that it's useful, and apologies if it's not. the first tip that I've got is attend with a friend. And I think this is probably the most peculiar sounding one, but just bear with me. I'm going to make my arguments. This was motivated by some patient public involvement, so PPI feedback that we got when we were setting up the hearing in teens study, where the teenagers, who were wonderful, said, you know, with the best will in the world, we're 16. And if you ask us to come and sit for 3.5 hours in a windowless lab with some weirdo who's going to stick electrodes on their head or prod and poke their ears, we're just not going to do it. It's just too weird. It's just too intimidating. And there's a certain amount of that we couldn't do anything about, right? You know, the lab is the lab, the measures are the measures, my personality is what it is. You know, we can't go changing all of it, but we could change the idea that you're doing it on your own. And we just thought maybe that just takes the edge away if you've got that moral support and that safety in numbers of being able to come along with a friend. It was really tricky to set this up because you can't just do the same stuff with people all the way through, or you'd need 2 researchers and there's only one of me. So we ended up taking very many months on end working out how to amend our methods, our equipment, the lab we use and how it's laid out in order to make it work so that 2 people could attend at the same time and both do the study in more or less the same time that it would ordinarily take one person to do it. And there's some really complex choreography involved, but it mainly relies on altering your measures so that a good 50% of them can be performed by one of the participants without the involvement of the researcher, whilst the researcher deals with the other participant, and then they swap over. So I'm going to show you what the schedule looks like for, and this is for the hearing in teen study. Don't worry too much about the details. I guess I'm trying to just give you a sense of what the structure of this is and how it might work for your own research if you were interested in using this. So essentially, our 2 teenagers come in together and do a few things together. So there's kind of introduction, consent, otoscopy, and TIMPs with them together, just getting kind of used to the lab and getting comfortable before we split them up. Then one of them goes off to fill in some questionnaires on their own while I do pure tone audiometry with the other. Then we swap over. Then one of them does extended high frequency audiometry, which is just run using a script on their own while I do acoustic emissions with the other. And then we move on to, one of them doing digits in noise on their own while I do the middle ear muscle reflex with another. And then that more or less continues in that vein for the remainder of the session. And the way it works is that I'm constantly busy. I'm always doing something. And the teenagers are mostly busy, with the exception of the kind of white marked blocks that you can see on the spreadsheet there where they've got a bit of spare time. And as a result, we're able to get through the test battery, which would normally be 3 hours, in about 3 hours, 20 minutes or so. So it only adds about 20 minutes to the test battery. So it was a fiddle to set up, but once you've got it running, if you're organized, it can work pretty well. And the benefits have been absolutely enormous. I cannot overemphasize what an unmitigated success this has been. So in terms of researcher capacity, lab capacity, equipment capacity, clearly that enhances all of those because we're getting 2 for the price of 1. Participation has clearly been made less daunting. A lot of people have said, I'd have been really scared to do this on my own, but with a friend, it was really workable. But the really big difference it's made has been in participant diversity. And we hadn't really predicted this, but so many people have said that for kind of cultural or family reasons, they just wouldn't have been able to attend on their own. So, their mum and dad just would not have let them do it, or it wouldn't be culturally appropriate for them to attend without a chaperone. And realistically, family don't have time to come and chaperone them. So the fact that they were able to attend with their mate or attend with their sister has meant that they've been able to take this opportunity up, whereas they wouldn't otherwise. So really, really helpful in terms of diversity. And actually, we've got some data on that later. And this is all especially useful if participant availability during working hours is restricted, as is the case in this study. So, they're teenagers, they're at school or college, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So a lot of these sessions end up being weekend or evening. And, if I'm not going to absolutely destroy my home life, I need to make sure that each of those sessions is really producing in terms of productivity on the grant. So the fact that we can do 2 for 1 in those periods is really helpful. And we've since used this strategy in a second study, and it's had similar benefits. Checklist Manifesto is the name of a book, a fantastic book that I recommend by Atul Gawande, who is a physician. And Atul Gawande's team is responsible for creation for the World Health Organizational WHO surgical safety checklist, which is the single sheet thing that gets displayed in a really prominent position in every operating theatre around the world, and has been a storming success. And it says, it answers such staggeringly straightforward questions as, who is it that we have on our operating table? Which leg are we cutting off, and have we marked it with a marker? Do we have enough blood of the right type so that if they bleed out, we've got it covered? Do they have any horrendous allergies that mean that if we inject them with a particular drug, they're going to die? And all of this is so basic that, unsurprisingly, when the surgical safety checklist was introduced, a lot of surgical staff were pretty outraged that these patronizing people were telling them that they didn't know how to do their jobs, that they didn't know what they were doing. And Ethel Gwandi's team's point at the time, which is repeated in the book, is that this isn't the case at all. That when it comes to incredibly highly skilled professions like people building really tall skyscrapers, or surgeons, or air traffic controllers, when errors happen, and particularly when really catastrophic errors happen, they are not errors of ignorance, they are errors of ineptitude. So it's not a matter of people not knowing their business. These are highly skilled, highly expert people. It's a matter of, in the moment, your brain being overloaded and you not being able to apply that knowledge in a reliable way, but sometimes with devastating consequences. So their view was, you just need to write it down. You need to have everything that's core and important on there so that elements of these complex but routine procedures are not missed. And you need to have it in one place and have it absolutely visible by everyone involved at all times. And I think my contention is that I think research is the same. So I think that the people running research projects are phenomenally bright, hugely knowledgeable, but they just have too much to deal with in these routine but complex data collection sessions. So we now use a checklist for everything. It's a single piece of paper without exception. Without exception, it sits atop all the other data collection documents at all times, so it's visible at all stages throughout a data collection session. And it includes 3 kinds of information. The first kind is that it contains tick boxes for all the procedures that you need to do with everyone. And, they don't leave the lab until you've dealt with each of those potential tick boxes. The second kind of information is that it has little reminders about how you perform those procedures, the kind of things that are really easy to miss. So, remember to run this script before you do this particular hearing test, or remember to take the headphones off for this stage of the data collection session, or remember to ask people if they want to go to the toilet at this stage, because, if in half an hour they need to go to the loo and they're already wired up, it's going to be a nightmare. And I'm almost ashamed to admit how effective this has been for us, because I like to think that I was fairly good at my job before. But the reality is that introducing this has made such a difference to us. In terms of procedures not getting missed, in terms of data quality, but also in terms of the experience of the participant, because everything just flows better. You're giving people a really carefully managed, warm, kind of supportive feeling experience where they feel like they're in safe hands and they're having a lovely time. And that's really helped with retention of people in our research, in my opinion. So yeah, maybe it seems really obvious to have a single one-page checklist that's visible at all times and covers absolutely all the core stuff you need for a data collection session, but it wasn't obvious to me, and it's really made a difference in the work that we do. Pre-reg is not so painful. So yeah, I'm going to put in a big plug in favor of pre-registration. Pre-registration of research protocols arose to solve a problem. And the problem basically is that, let's say imagine that we're people who use a sort of null hypothesis statistical testing framework. So we're people that work with p-values. What does a p-value of 0.04 mean? It means that if we make up a totally nonsense data set just using random number generators, and we run tests for 100 potential associations in that data set, on average, 4 will give us apparently positive results, despite the fact that there's nothing really there. And the problem is that everyone likes positive results, right? Our bosses like them, reviewers, editors, grant panels, promotions committees. Everyone's happy to see positive results. And one of the easiest ways to get them is not to do good research, asking simple questions and sensible questions. It's to scoop up a really complex data set and then go exploring around it after the fact and see what these sort of random positive results that pop up are and publish those. And the problem with this, of course, is that if this happens on a wide scale, and I think it probably does, albeit unwittingly a lot of the time, then it means that a lot of the apparently positive results in the literature are just not real. And if the same study were repeated with a fresh sample, they wouldn't replicate. So pre-registration of study protocols just means that we say exactly what we're going to do before we gather the data. And we don't just say what we're going to do in terms of data collection methods, because that part we kind of cover anyway with our ethics applications, right? But we need to also lay out in detail what exactly we're going to do to process the data, what hypotheses we're going to test, and the statistical models that we're going to use to test those hypotheses. And it has to be absolutely comprehensive. The idea is that you have no decisions left to make once your data are in. So why formally pre-register? Why not just decide this stuff in yourself and not necessarily tell the world about it? I think the answer to that is that mostly when we do this, it's not because we're sociopaths, it's because it's really easy to do accidentally. So accidental p-hacking is super simple. Studies are full of myriad decisions. Scientists are busy, and all you have to do is be a little bit vague about precisely what it is that you intend to do, or procrastinate those decisions, or forget precisely what decisions it was that you made, or be a bit wishful in your thinking, and lo and behold, you've accidentally p-hacked. And all of this stuff is just profoundly human and so easy to do. So like I said, I don't think it takes a sociopath to do this. I think we're all prone to it if we don't deliberately tie our hands and prevent ourselves from doing it. I think a pretty good template for a pre-reg is the standard template from the Open Science Framework. It includes things like sample size, what variables we're going to measure, what sort of derived variables we're going to compute, precisely what our hypotheses are that we're going to test, what transformations of our data we're going to apply, what inference criteria we're going to use, what analysis models we're going to use, and what we're going to do about outliers and missing data. And I think if you're someone who's run a few research studies, you'd say, well, these are all decisions that I make anyway. And I think that brings me to an important point, which is that, in my opinion, pre-reg doesn't create any work that you wouldn't have to do anyway. It just changes when you have to do it. You have to make all the same decisions, you just make them at the outset. And if I'm honest, this does massively front load the work of doing a research study, because right at the beginning, when you're doing your ethics application and when you're doing your study setup and piloting, you're also having to write this enormous pre-reg document. But it also means that it's absolutely plain sailing once the data come in. It's just kind of a smooth ride to publication then. And personally, I quite like it. All the pain at the beginning, and then it's easy days at the end. You will feel a sting of regret if you see an apparent effect that you didn't include in your stated hypotheses. But crucially, you can still report this. You just report it as exploratory rather than confirmatory. And I think that's a really important point to stress to people who are skeptical of pre-reg. It doesn't stop data exploration, which is important. It just stops us misrepresenting our data exploration. And I'll finish this section with a quote from Richard Feynman, who said, "The first principle as a scientist is not to fool yourself, because you, of course, are the easiest person to fool." My fourth point is lean into PPI. So PPI, patient and public involvement. This is done as standard in all our research studies in Manchester. And if I'm being honest, I was a bit of a grump about it when this first came in, because as I've mentioned, the setup stage of a research project is so busy and fraught already. And additionally, having to sort of talk to the public and pretend to take their views on board, what were they going to know anyway, was really irritating to me. And I am ashamed at how wrong I have been. It's been just so hugely valuable, especially in the hearing and teen study. They've given us insights that have radically improved data quality, quantity of data, retention, all sorts of things. And the reason I think it worked so well was because we got really forceful advice to put a lot of effort in at the outset with this stuff. So they said you're going to need high quality materials to inform and to question your PPI volunteers. So it's really worth throwing yourself into this. And the reason why you have to get it just right is that if you give people too much information, you overwhelm and demotivate them. But also if you hold back too much, dumb it down, don't give people enough, then you might end up with answers to the specific questions that you've asked people. But what you miss out on is the stuff that you didn't expect. And we got a lot of that from the teenagers. So they were really great And it's certainly humbling to have a 16-year-old tell you that there's something to do with your research project that you've gotten terribly, terribly wrong, and they've spotted it and you haven't. But it's also incredibly useful in the long run. So yeah, throwing real effort into getting that right has paid off for us. It's also an enormously powerful tool for negotiating required research resources. I don't know how it is down at UCL, but in Manchester, we definitely have some real haggling we have to do with finance and IT to get the resources we require. And it is so much easier if you can come in brandishing a piece of paper that says, look, I'm not telling you that we need to be able to make payments in this way. The teenagers who want to take part from the varied backgrounds that we would wish to take part are the ones telling you that this has to happen. So it has allowed us to get our way quite a lot. And again, that's really paid off in terms of data quality and retention. And yes, so there have been very clear benefits to PPI for us in terms of volume and diversity of participants and in terms of data quality. And that brings me to my final related point, which is about money and equality, diversity, and inclusion. This is a bit of a kind of grubby, compromise seeming subject. And I talk about it not despite that, but because of that, because I don't think it gets talked about enough. I think it's important that we understand that if we don't consider the costs that our research poses on participants and how that would affect particularly people from diverse communities, then we're never going to combat the problem that we have of getting the same kinds of people in research projects kind of as we have done for decades in the past. So yeah, our research imposes costs. People have to spend time and effort considering whether to take part, working out practically how they take part, communicating with us, potentially traveling for data collection, and then the part we think about, actually doing the research. And then they potentially also have travel costs coming in. It's so important, I think, to have adequate compensation and also adequate methods for getting that compensation to individuals. And I think sometimes when you strenuously argue for being able to do this in ways that suit the population that you're looking at, sometimes you can be accused of sort of trying to coerce people with money, that you're not being sufficiently high-minded about this, that people should be doing it for pure reasons. And I want to forcefully counter that view. I think the reality is that if we're not considering the costs on participants and how to combat them for individuals, then we create a situation where participating in our research becomes a luxury, and the only people who will take part will be people who can afford that luxury. And this is going to disproportionately impact marginalized groups. So we've really pushed hard to get what we need to pay all kinds of people in the way that suits their lifestyle. And it's had a real effect on our participation statistics. So in the Hearing in Teens study, 17% of our participants come from the most deprived decile of the UK. We don't have ethnicity data, but we do have skin tone data, and they're enormously diverse. And I think it's probably fair to say that if the diversity in skin tone probably also corresponds to diversity in ethnicity, and that would be my experience of it as well. So I'm enormously grateful and proud that we've managed to achieve a level of diversity in our participants that I certainly haven't in my prior career. And I think that thinking about these kind of ugly practical issues is a huge part of that, and not being squeamish about that, I think is an important part of success. Thank you very much. That's everything. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Hannah. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have 10 minutes, so I'm going to open this for junior researchers, so students and postdocs. If you have questions first, please either unmute yourself or type it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with, and then we'll open it to everybody else. Okay, students, postdoc, questions? No? Happy to take questions from anyone else if anybody has a question. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Hi there. Oh, I'm a bit dark. Hold on, can't see me. Thank you very much, Anna. That was a lovely talk and had some really great things to note in it. One thing I've been working on recently was what you think of as an intelligibility metric, something which predicts the intelligibility of speech to hearing impaired listeners. And the question is, what kinds of factors go into such a model? And most of the previous work has talked about normally hearing listeners, so it always just talks about the signal. So what information is in the signal, assuming on the assumption that all normal hearing listeners are all the same. But obviously when you get to hearing impaired listeners, not all hearing impaired listeners are the same, and you need ways of essentially assessing them, describing them, such that you can make a prediction that this particular signal will be 70% intelligible to that person. And one of the studies that we looked at was quite a number of different kinds of factors about hearing and measurements of hearing, assessments of the sort of the psychoacoustics of hearing impairment, and to what extent did they're useful predictors for intelligibility. And one of the interesting things was that the digit test was extremely poor at predicting speech intelligibility. And I saw that you were using it an awful lot in your research, either digits in noise or digit triple test. I think you mentioned both of those. And you also had a graph which showed that the digit in noise test correlated with pure tone audiometry as well, which is sort of then saying, well, why are you doing it really? If it correlates with pure tone audiometry, why are you doing it? So the question is really, why this focus on digits? Is it just because it's easy to do? Or do you think it gives you some information about hearing that you don't get in some other way? Or do you use it because you think it's a proxy for speech intelligibility?
I think, let's be honest, I think one of the reasons is it's dead simple. It's there, right? But there's some more focused and considered arguments for it as well. So in some cases, when it's the remote stuff, the remote testing, the justifications are twofold, probably, really. So one is that you can't do pure tone audiometry, remotely, can you? Not really. If you're using people's own devices and headphones or earphones because of the calibration issues. There's some ways sort of around it, but a speech test is probably the best we're going to get, or close to it. And I think the issue with something more cognitively demanding and complex than the digits in noise is you start to get more influence of those cognitive factors coming in, and mostly that's not what we're interested in, right?
Well, that's a good thing. If you want to know whether hearing impairment is affecting people's lives, what do people use their hearing for, right?
Yeah. So I think for things like, for example, Adnan's thing, where we're trying to use it to predict audiometry. Actually, in that case, we don't want those cognitive factors coming in. We want to know, because it's really difficult to get, to get this lady to an audiology clinic on the other side of the West Bank. We need to know, is it worth going through all of that, especially when the services are so overwhelmed because they're so few and far between. We need to have a good sense of what is going to pop out on the pure tone audiometry. So we want to know, is she or is she not likely to have a pure tone average, beyond 30 dB AHL, say. So it's helpful from that point of view. But so we're less interested in it as an indicator of functional hearing ability for speech than we are as a kind of predictor of hearing loss in a way. But then when we're using it for things like, let's say the ear audit, where we're interested in it, and I sort of made reference to ecological validity there, didn't I? So yes, why do we not care? I think it's because, we're trying to use it kind of backwards, aren't we, really? We're not trying to understand, for the most part, how to what extent are these deficits that might be caused by noise likely to cause a person a difficulty in a real-world listening situation. We are mostly at the stage of just trying to find out whether they exist, we're trying to find out, is it the case that noise is capable of causing measurable deficits, measurable changes, or measurable pathology in people with normal audiograms? And then the question of how impactful that is on hearing is kind of secondary. And in a way, if it doesn't have much of an impact on functional speech perception, don't tell our funders. I don't think we want to know yet. So we're kind of at earlier stages. We are trying to get at something not that functional. We're principally interested in, is there pathology and what can we do about it?
Because you also mentioned synaptopathy.
Yes.
And I don't know what the research is on there, but are things like digit tests or other tests which reveal that kind of hidden hearing loss? I don't know. That's the question really. I have no feeling whether there is a good test out there.
I don't think we have definitive evidence that there is anything. And my personal hunch is that probably if there are perceptual impacts of synaptopathy, they are probably completely dwarfed and overwhelmed by everything else, by cognition, by attention, by motivation. By language, facility with the particular language that you're working in, with memory, with all of that stuff. So my hunch is that the perceptual effects are not going to be there, but we're as well to check, aren't we? And it's something that we can do remotely, because of the fact that a digits in noise test is just so easily performed via the internet. Yeah,
unfortunately, the ease of use dominates everything else.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Oh, no worries. Thank you. Great questions. Appreciate it.
On that digits and noise test, Hannah, the rest was interesting too, but I want to continue with that.
Please.
There are studies that don't find a huge correlation between digits and noise and pure tone audiogram, I think, when they present diotic stimuli or so. And when you use the antiphasic stimuli, I think the correlations were fantastic when you correct for age. So if that gets confirmed, I think that could be entirely new form of testing remotely for digits and noise. Do you have any idea why that is? I mean, it's binary, but why is the antiphasic element so important?
Yeah, so Karina D'Souza and colleagues have blazed a trail in this regard. So they have papers from 2020 and 2021 that look at this stuff, and some of it in really large sample sizes. I think it's in Dutch, maybe. Or maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe it is English. Anyway, or South African, possibly. Anyway, they have great data on it. And part of the reason why the antiphasic works so well is the definitions that we use. So we are looking at predictors of worse ear hearing loss, because in the context of remote hearing screening, that's what we care about, right? We care about, do you have at least one ear that's dodgy, that could do with some audiological intervention? So worse ear hearing loss tends to correlate much better with the antiphasic, whereas better ear hearing loss tends to correlate much better with the diotic. Because obviously with the diotic, if you've got one good ear, it does all the work. But with antiphasic, if you've got differences between the ears, or at least one ear that's problematic, then that affects that binaural integration. So it's partly a definition issue. But I think for remote hearing screening, like I said, what we want to know is, do you have at least one ear that we can help you with? The antiphasic is enormously valuable. But also the greater reliability, the greater retest reliability of it, I think gives it a real edge as well. You've just got, and that's driven largely by much greater between subject variability in performance. So, the range of thresholds is huge. It's sort of, a good 20 decibels or so. So whereas for the diotic, it's much more compressed. And so that absence of between subject variability reduces your reliability.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. I think I will use that test in at least my online experiments.
Yeah. Let me send you.
We have the audiogram.
Yeah. Let me send you the D'Souza papers, because they are great.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. And as I've said, the rest I could give many comments, but really great talk.
Thank you very much.
Hi,
Anne.
Hi, Hannah. That was a really nice talk. Thanks. It was good to hear about the wide variety of projects that you're involved with. I found it interesting you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about moving from the idea of kind of self-reported lifetime exposure to these longitudinal measures, which makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. But it's kind of interesting getting some insights based on your experience of kind of asking people to self-report noise exposure. Do you think there are kind of any intervals, for example, that people are able to report more reliably? So instead of looking back over the lifetime, maybe is the last kind of week, month, year, is that kind of diagnostic of someone's exposure?
Well, the judgments we have on this are subjective. We haven't validated this. So in the kind of piloting and the PPI that we were doing, it was mostly about asking people to do it and how confident they were in their reports. And the sense that we got from with the teenagers was that 18 months was doable, and any longer than 18 months just was not. A year was perfect, but I think that's partly because at that stage in your life is sort of divided up in terms of school years. So you're thinking from kind of summer holiday to summer holiday, and that's how it structures. But 18 months worked fine, and it's continuing to work fine, I think, at least subjectively from the point of view of the participants. However, I think I would make the point that these are teenagers and their lives are in total flux, right? Everything is changing all the time. Life is shifting so rapidly. It might be that if you were working with older populations, that the length of the interval that gets you something reasonably accurate might lengthen as life goes on and life becomes less full, at least for most of us, and certainly less noisy, I think, for the majority of people. So my guess would be that you need really short intervals with the young, and then you can lengthen it out as we get into the quieter, more sedate portions of our lives. But that's subjective. I have no data on that. So
yeah, no, that's interesting anyway. Thanks. Yeah.
No worries.
There's a question in the chat, Hannah, about whether you're going to be following the adolescents longitudinally in that project, or was it just a one time point kind of study?
So we got them at 16 to 17. I'm seeing them again in 2025. I'm seeing all of them. All 220 are coming back, or as many as I can get. And at that point, they'll be 19. In fact, most of them will be 20. So that's the main follow-up. But realistically, if we have some useful findings, given the motivation in this cohort, I think we will try and continue it on. It would be lovely to see them back at then 23 or back at 27 and just keep this going, which, quite selfishly is great from the point of view of my career. But it is so exciting that retention is so high and they're so motivated to carry on and keep providing data. So I think it could be a really valuable cohort.
Great, thank you. And we're already a bit over time, but if anybody has any pressing questions, I think you can just get in touch with Hannah or maybe email her. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was just really, really great. And it's very exciting to hear about all these cool projects. We're very glad you joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the great questions. I appreciate it. It made it really enjoyable. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.